The mud was still wet on her boots when Clara Hargrove burst through the front doors of her own house and heard a stranger promise to marry her sister. She did not know that yet. All she knew was that she was late, that the east fence had finally given way and let 3 sheep wander into the neighbor's turnip field, and that her father was going to be furious about the state of her dress before he even noticed the animals were safe. She smelled of hay and rain. Her hair had come loose from its pins somewhere between the fence and the kitchen door. She had exactly one thought in her head, which was that she needed dry stockings before dinner, and she carried that single thought straight into the drawing room, where 12 people turned to look at her at once. The room went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. Her father, Lord Hargrove, stood near the fireplace with the look of a man who has bet his last coin and is waiting to see if the coin lands right side up. Her 3 older sisters sat in a row on the good chairs, dressed as though for church, though it was a Tuesday. Margaret had her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Charlotte was staring at the floor. Eleanor, the middle one, wore an expression Clara had never seen on her before, something between hope and horror, as if she could not decide which one to commit to. And standing by the window, half turned toward the door Clara had just come through, was a man she had never seen in her life. He was tall in the way that made a room feel smaller, dressed in a coat that had clearly never seen mud, rain, or an honest day's work. His face was doing something complicated. It looked like the face of a man who had just heard his own voice say something and was now, half a second too late, wondering why. "I beg your pardon," Clara said, because it seemed like the only thing to say, and also because 13 years of being the youngest daughter had taught her that when a room goes silent like that, the safest thing is to apologize first and ask questions later. Nobody answered her. Her father cleared his throat. "This," he said, in the too bright voice he used when he was trying to rescue a situation that had already gone past rescuing, "is my youngest daughter, Clara." The stranger's eyes moved over her, over the mud, over the hay, over the stockings that were most certainly not dry, and something shifted in his expression that Clara could not read. It was not admiration. It was not disgust. It looked, if anything, like a man doing arithmetic and not liking the sum. "Your Grace," her father went on, and there it was, the title that explained the good chairs and the church clothes and the terrible silence. "May I present the Duke of Ashcombe?" Clara had heard the name before. Everyone in the county had heard the name before. The Duke of Ashcombe was the sort of man who existed mostly as a rumor, a figure spoken of at markets and in church pews, a man whose estate was 3 times the size of anyone else's and whose fortune was the subject of more speculation than the weather. She had never expected to meet him. She had certainly never expected to meet him while smelling of sheep. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped a curtsy that was probably not deep enough, because her knees were tired, and her boots were heavy with mud, and she had not, in fact, planned on being presented to nobility that afternoon. The Duke did not bow. He looked instead at her father, with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to be angry. "You did not mention a 4th daughter," he said. "She is often occupied with the grounds," Lord Hargrove said quickly. "She is not usually present for meetings such as this," the Duke finished, and the words had an edge to them that made Clara's stomach tighten, though she still did not understand why. She looked from her father to her sisters to the stranger by the window, and slowly, the way cold water finds its way through a crack in a boot, understanding began to seep in. "What meeting is this?" she asked. Nobody answered her right away. Margaret looked at their father. Charlotte looked at the fire. It was Eleanor, finally, who spoke, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound steady and did not quite manage it. "His Grace has come to discuss father's debt," Eleanor said. "The one owed to his late brother's estate." Clara knew about the debt. Everyone in the house knew about the debt, the way everyone knows about a leak in the roof that nobody has the money to fix, a problem that gets mentioned only when it rains hard enough to matter. She had not known it was this bad. She had not known it was bad enough to bring a duke to their drawing room in person, dressed for an occasion no one had warned her about. "And what," she asked slowly, "does that have to do with my sisters sitting here in their church clothes?" The Duke answered before her father could. "Your father owes an amount he cannot pay," he said, with the flat honesty of a man who had stopped bothering to soften bad news a long time ago. "I offered him a way to settle it that would not ruin his family. I told him I would marry whichever of his daughters he thought most suitable. It does not matter to me which one. One arrangement is much like another." The words landed in the room like a dropped plate, sharp and final, and for a moment nobody moved. Clara felt something rise in her chest that she did not have a polite word for. It was not quite anger. It was closer to the feeling she got when a customer at market tried to pay her half of what her vegetables were worth, because he assumed a girl in muddy boots would not know any better. "One arrangement is much like another," she repeated. "You are speaking of my sisters as though they were sacks of grain." The room seemed to hold its breath. Her father made a small strangled sound that might have been a warning. The Duke turned his full attention on her for the first time, and it was not a comfortable thing to be looked at like that, as though she were a puzzle that had rudely interrupted a much simpler equation. "I am speaking of an arrangement that will save this family from ruin," he said. "I would think a daughter of this house might show some gratitude, rather than correcting the man offering it. I would think," Clara said, before she could stop herself, "that a man offering marriage might learn the names of the women he is offering to marry before he calls them interchangeable." Somewhere behind her, she heard Charlotte make a small, horrified noise. Her father's face had gone the color of old parchment, but the Duke did not look angry, not exactly. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had been struck by something he had not seen coming, and was still working out where the blow had landed. "You have opinions," he said slowly, "for a girl who arrived through the servant's entrance smelling of livestock." "I arrived through the front door," Clara said. "Same as you. I simply did not have the warning that I ought to dress for an auction." "Clara," her father said, in a voice that begged her to stop. She did not stop, not entirely, but she pressed her lips together and said nothing further, because she could see now what she had walked into. The careful arrangement of her sisters like goods on display, the debt hanging over the room like smoke, and the stranger by the window who had just offered to marry any one of them as though the choice were a matter of no more consequence than choosing a horse from a stable. The Duke studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to her father, and his voice, when it came, had changed. The anger folded away somewhere she could not see. "Which one is it to be, then?" he said. "Let us finish what we started." Lord Hargrove looked at his 3 eldest daughters, and Clara watched something pass over his face, a calculation he did not want to be making, a father trying to decide which of his children to hand over first. It was, she thought, one of the ugliest things she had ever seen a person do, and she had grown up on a farm, where she had seen animals sold plenty of times. Margaret spoke first, her voice small. "I would be honored, Your Grace." "No," the Duke said, cutting her off, and he was still looking at Clara. The room went silent again, silent in that same terrible way, and Clara felt every eye in the room shift toward her at once, the way the sheep had shifted when the fence gave way, all moving in the same direction without any of them quite deciding to. "I beg your pardon," her father said faintly. "Your youngest," the Duke said, "is the only person in this room who has said a true thing to me since I arrived. I find I would rather marry honesty than obedience." Clara felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her mud-caked boots. "I did not offer myself," she said, as evenly as she could manage, though her heart was doing something frantic and unfamiliar in her chest. "I do not wish to marry a man who thinks daughters are interchangeable." "Then we are agreed on one thing at least," the Duke said, and there was something in his voice now that was almost, though not quite, amusement. "Because I do not think that any longer either." Her father made a sound of pure relief, the sound of a drowning man finding a rope, and began speaking rapidly about arrangements and dates and blessings, and Clara stood in the middle of the room in her ruined dress, with hay still caught in her hair, and understood, with the sinking clarity of watching a fence finally give way for good, that her whole life had just changed direction, and no one had thought to ask her first. The wedding took place 11 days later, in a chapel too grand for a bride who had never in her life owned a dress that did not have a tear mended somewhere along the hem. Clara stood at the altar in white silk that had belonged to a woman she had never met, some long-dead duchess whose measurements happened to be close enough to her own, and she kept her chin level and her hands still, because the alternative was to let every person in that chapel see how badly her fingers were shaking. Her father sat in the front pew looking like a man who had been given a second chance at breathing. Her sisters sat behind him, Margaret dabbing at her eyes for reasons Clara suspected had more to do with relief than sentiment, Charlotte watching the whole affair with open curiosity, Eleanor alone meeting Clara's eyes now and then with something that looked almost like guilt. The Duke stood beside her and said his vows, in a voice that gave away nothing at all. He might have been reading a shipping manifest. When the ceremony ended and he was permitted to kiss his bride, he did so briefly, correctly, the way a man signs a document he has already decided he regrets, and Clara understood in that moment exactly what kind of marriage she had entered. It was not going to be a marriage of affection, it was going to be a transaction that happened to require a ring. She told herself this on the long carriage ride to Ashcombe, watching the fields she had known her whole life give way to unfamiliar country, hedgerows and stone walls, and finally, rising out of the mist like something built by a different sort of hand entirely, the great house itself. It was larger than any building she had ever stood inside. It had more windows than her father's entire estate had rooms. She climbed down from the carriage with her one trunk of belongings, most of which were the wrong sort of clothes for a house like this, and stood looking up at it while the Duke walked past her without a word, as though the house were simply an extension of himself and required no introduction. A woman came out to meet them on the front steps, tall and gray-haired, dressed in dark wool with a ring of keys at her waist that marked her as the person who actually ran the place. "Mrs. Dobson," the Duke said. "This is the Duchess." Mrs. Dobson's eyes moved over Clara the same way the Duke's had, in the drawing room that first afternoon, taking in the plain trunk and the traveling dress that had clearly been mended more than once. Whatever conclusion she reached, she kept it off her face. "Welcome to Ashcombe, Your Grace," she said, with a curtsy that was correct in every particular and warm in none of them, and led Clara inside. The first week was the loneliest of Clara's life. She had grown up in a house that was too small and too loud, where her sisters argued over hairpins and her father's dog slept on the good furniture, and everyone knew everyone's business before breakfast was finished. Ashcombe was the opposite of all of it. The halls were long and quiet enough that she could hear her own footsteps echo back at her from 3 rooms away. The staff were polite and distant, the way people are polite and distant with someone they have not yet decided to trust. The Duke himself she saw perhaps twice a day, at meals that were conducted almost entirely in silence, broken only by the scrape of silver against china and the occasional comment about the weather that neither of them meant. She missed the sheep. She missed the smell of hay. She missed her sisters arguing, which she had spent years complaining about and now would have given a great deal to hear again. On the 4th day, she found the stables. It happened almost by accident. She had gone walking to escape the echoing quiet of the house, following a path that led past the kitchen gardens and around a low stone wall, and there they were, larger and better kept than her father's had ever been, but stables all the same, with the same warm animal smell and the same low nickering sounds that had been the background music of her entire childhood. A stable hand named Peter was struggling with a mare that would not stand still for shoeing, pulling at the lead rope with the increasingly desperate energy of a man who was about to be kicked. "You are holding her wrong," Clara said, before she had decided to say anything at all. Peter looked up, startled, clearly unsure what to make of a duchess appearing at the stable door in a day dress, offering opinions on horsemanship. "Beg pardon, Your Grace?" "She is not fighting you because she is frightened," Clara said, walking closer, already reaching for the lead rope with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She is fighting you because you are gripping too tight, and she can feel it all the way up her neck. Loosen your hand. Let her feel that you trust her to stand." She took the rope herself to demonstrate, murmuring something low and steady to the mare, the same nonsense words she had used on nervous animals her whole life, and within a minute the horse had gone still and calm beneath her hand, allowing the farrier to finish his work without further trouble. Peter stared at her as though she had performed some kind of magic trick. "Not magic," Clara said, catching his expression. "Just years of practice. I was raised more in a stable than a drawing room, if I am honest, and I have never seen the harm in it." Word of the incident traveled through the house faster than she expected. By dinner that evening, she noticed the Duke watching her with an expression she could not quite place, somewhere between curiosity and something more guarded. "I hear you settled a difficult mare today," he said, over a course of soup neither of them had touched. "I did. Peter tells me she has thrown 3 grooms this month." "She was not being difficult," Clara said. "She was being honest about being handled badly. There is a difference." Something flickered across the Duke's face, gone before she could name it. "You speak of horses the way you spoke to me, in your father's drawing room. Is that a complaint, Your Grace?" "I have not decided yet," he said, and for the first time since the wedding, Clara thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, not quite a smile, but close enough to its shadow that she noticed. It became, without either of them quite agreeing to it, a pattern. She would say something plain and unvarnished at dinner, some observation about the house, or the staff, or the strange formal quiet of the place, and he would respond with something dry that was not quite warmth, but was no longer entirely cold either. She began to notice things about him that did not match the man from that first terrible afternoon. He read late into the night, she discovered, from the candlelight that showed beneath his study door, long after the rest of the house had gone dark. He was kind to the staff in small, unannounced ways, a raise for an aging groundskeeper, new boots quietly ordered for a stable boy whose old ones had worn through. He did not speak of his brother, ever, though she noticed the portrait of a young man in the East Hall that no one in the household would explain to her. She began, despite herself, to be curious about him. Curiosity was a dangerous thing to feel toward a man she had married under duress, and she knew it, and she tried, for a while, to ignore it. It was harder to ignore after the incident with the ledgers. She found them by accident, in the study, while looking for a book she had been told she might borrow. The Duke was away for the afternoon, meeting with a solicitor in the nearest town, and she had wandered into his study more out of loneliness than purpose, running her fingers along the spines of books she did not recognize, when she noticed the household accounts left open on the desk, and beside them a second set of papers that were not household accounts at all. They were letters, old ones, the ink faded, addressed to a name she recognized from the portrait in the East Hall, Henry. She should not have read them. She knew that even as her eyes moved over the first lines, and she told herself she would stop, and she did not stop, because the words on the page were not what she expected at all. They were desperate. They were the letters of a younger brother pleading with an older one for help, for money, for time, written in a hand that grew increasingly unsteady toward the bottom of the page, and dated only months before the debt her father owed had been called in. She heard the study door open behind her, and turned, the letter still in her hand, and found the Duke standing in the doorway with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not quite, but something rawer and more frightened than anger, the look of a man who has just discovered someone standing in a room he had thought was locked. "Put that down," he said, very quietly. Clara set the letter back on the desk, her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear of him and everything to do with the sudden, dizzying sense that she had just found the edge of something much larger than she had understood, something that had shaped this whole strange marriage long before she had walked through her father's front door with mud on her boots. "Who was Henry?" she asked. "And what does he have to do with why you needed a wife so quickly that you were willing to marry any daughter my father put in front of you?" The Duke did not answer. He crossed the room, took the letters from the desk, and locked them away in a drawer with hands that were, she noticed, not entirely steady. "That is not your concern," he said. "I am your wife," Clara said. "I would have thought that made it exactly my concern." "You are my wife because your father owed a debt," the Duke said, and his voice had gone flat again, the way it had been at the altar, the voice of a man retreating behind a wall he had built a long time ago, and trusted more than he trusted people. "Do not mistake this arrangement for something it is not." The words landed harder than she expected, harder, she realized with some surprise, than she wanted to admit. She had not meant to start caring what he thought of her. She had not meant to notice the candlelight under his study door, or the quiet kindness to the staff, or the shadow of a smile at dinner. And now here he was, reminding her in the coldest terms available exactly what she was to him, a debt made flesh, nothing more. "Then I will remember that," she said, and turned and left the study without another word, and if her eyes were burning slightly as she walked away, she told herself it was only the dust from the old books, and nothing more than that at all. 3 days passed before the Duke spoke to her again, beyond what courtesy required, and in those 3 days Clara learned more about silence than she had ever wanted to know. She kept to the stables mostly, finding in the animals a kind of company that did not require careful words or guarded looks. Peter had grown used to her by now and no longer flinched when she corrected his handling of a nervous colt or suggested a different bit for a mare who kept tossing her head at the bridle. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. It was, she thought bitterly, the only place in this enormous cold house where she felt like herself and not like a debt with a face. It was Mrs. Dobson who finally broke the silence, on the evening of the 3rd day, finding Clara in the small parlor where she had taken to sitting after dinner rather than face another meal of clinking silver and unspoken things. "You will want to know about Henry," Mrs. Dobson said, without preamble, setting down a tray of tea Clara had not asked for. Clara looked up sharply. "His Grace does not wish it discussed." "His Grace does not wish a great many things discussed," Mrs. Dobson said, "and yet here we all are, living inside them regardless." She poured 2 cups, handed one to Clara, and settled into the chair across from her with the air of a woman who had decided something and did not intend to be argued out of it. Henry was the younger brother, 2 years younger. Bright as anything, the kind of boy who could make an entire dinner table laugh without trying. Everyone loved Henry. "What happened to him?" "He gambled," Mrs. Dobson said simply. "Not at first in any way that mattered. A young man's habit, cards and horses, nothing his Grace's father did not do at that age himself. But it grew. It grew the way these things grow, quietly, until quietly was no longer possible." Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup and said nothing, waiting. "He came to his Grace for help, more than once. Each time his Grace paid what was owed, and each time believed it would be the last. It was never the last." Mrs. Dobson's voice had gone careful, the voice of someone picking her way across a floor she knew had weak boards in it. "The final debt was larger than anything before it, owed to a man not known for his patience. Henry could not pay it, and his Grace was traveling abroad at the time, some months on business that could not be delayed, and by the time word reached him and he returned." She stopped. "He was already dead," Clara finished quietly. Mrs. Dobson nodded once. "Some say it was an accident. His Grace does not believe that, and I do not believe it either, though it is not spoken of in this house, and I would ask you not to speak of it either, not directly, not to him. He carries it like a stone he has decided never to set down." Clara sat with that for a long moment, the tea going cold in her hands, thinking of the portrait in the East Hall, the young bright face that she had walked past a dozen times without knowing what it cost the man she had married to look at it every day. "What does any of this have to do with my father's debt?" she asked finally. "With the marriage?" Here, Mrs. Dobson hesitated, and for the first time, Clara saw something like real reluctance cross her face. "There is a clause in the old Duke's will," she said slowly. "His Grace's father's will. It concerns the estate and the title, and what happens should his Grace fail to marry and produce an heir within 5 years of his brother's death. The old Duke did not trust that his sons would manage the family's affairs wisely between them. He built in a safeguard, or what he believed was a safeguard. Should His Grace remain unmarried past the appointed date, the estate passes not to him in full, but into trust, managed by a cousin His Grace has never had reason to trust, a man who would see this house, these tenants, everyone who depends on Ashcombe, treated as nothing more than an asset to be stripped for profit. Clara felt something cold settle into her stomach. And the date? Falls in 6 weeks, Mrs. Dobson said. He has known for over a year that he needed to marry. He put it off as long as he dared, grieving, I think, though he would never call it that. Then your father's debt came due, and a solution presented itself that solved 2 problems with one arrangement: a marriage he needed and a debt he was owed. I do not say this to excuse how coldly he went about it. I say it only so you understand there was more at stake than cruelty. Clara set down her tea, her hands not quite steady. He could have told me, she said, any of it. Instead, he let me believe I was simply convenient. You were convenient, Mrs. Dobson said, not unkindly. That does not mean you are nothing more than that, whatever he has allowed himself to say to you, or to himself. Clara did not sleep well that night. She lay in the wide, cold bed in the room that had been given to her, listening to the house settle around her, and thought about a young man dead before his time, and an older brother who had built himself a wall so high that even his own grief had to knock to be let in, and a will that had turned 5 years of loss into a countdown clock, and a marriage that had begun as a transaction and now felt, to her great and unwelcome surprise, like something she did not want reduced to that any longer. She found him the next morning in the study, standing at the window with his back to the door, and for once she did not wait to be invited in. Mrs. Dobson told me about Henry, she said, and about the will. She watched his shoulders go rigid, watched him take a slow breath before he turned to face her, and braced for the flat, cold voice she had come to expect whenever the subject strayed too close to anything real. She had no right, he said, but there was less force in it than she expected, as though he had known this moment was coming and had simply hoped to delay it a little longer. She had every right, Clara said. I am your wife. I have been living in a house full of silence for weeks, being told I am not permitted to ask questions about the man I married, and all the while there was a reason, a real one, and you let me believe I was simply the price of a debt. You were the price of a debt, the Duke said, and though his voice was quiet, there was something underneath it now that had not been there before, something raw and unguarded. That was true the day we married. I will not pretend otherwise, because you have shown me again and again that you have no patience for pretending, and I find I have grown tired of it myself. Then what has changed? I do not know how to answer that without sounding like a man reaching for comfort he has not earned, he said, and turned away from her again, back toward the window, back toward whatever it was out there in the gray morning light that he found easier to look at than her face. I stopped expecting kindness from anyone a long time ago. Somewhere between my brother's letters and my brother's grave, I decided it was safer not to want things from people, because wanting things is how you end up buried by them when they fail you. I built this house into a fortress, and I built myself into one along with it, and it worked well enough, until a girl walked into a drawing room smelling of hay and told a duke to his face that he did not know his own daughter's names. Clara said nothing, watching him, waiting. I do not know what I am offering you, he said finally, still facing the window. I am not a man who has practiced saying kind things. I do not know how to be married the way other men seem to know it, with soft words and easy affection. I know how to protect this house. I know how to protect the people in it. I have not been given much practice at protecting a wife, and I am aware that admitting that is not the same as an apology. No, Clara agreed. It is not. He turned back to look at her then, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before, not since the drawing room, not since any of it, something unguarded and uncertain in a man who had clearly spent years making sure his face never showed either of those things. I am sorry, he said, and the words came out stiff, unpracticed, like a language he had not spoken in a long time and was relearning as he went. Not for marrying you. I do not regret that. Whatever else I have gotten wrong, I am sorry for treating you as though you were only ever the solution to a problem. You are not. You have not been that, not for some time now, and I have known it, and said nothing, because saying it felt like handing you a piece of myself I was not certain I could survive losing. Clara felt her throat tighten in a way she had not expected, standing in that cold study with the gray morning light falling across both of them. I do not forgive you, she said quietly, because it was true, and because she had learned by now that this man, whatever else he was, valued the truth more than comfortable lies. Not yet. You hurt me, and pretending otherwise would not help either of us. I do not ask you to, he said. I only ask that you not leave. I was not planning to leave, Clara said. I am not the kind of person who runs from a fence simply because it has fallen down. I am the kind of person who fixes it. Something that was almost a real smile crossed his face then, brief and startled, as though he had forgotten his own mouth still knew how to make that shape. Then perhaps, he said, we might begin again. Not the marriage. That is done, and I do not wish to undo it. But whatever this is, between the two of us, apart from the papers that made it legal. Clara considered him for a long moment, this tall, cold man who had just handed her, awkwardly and without practice, the most honest thing he had said to her since the day they met. 6 weeks, she said finally, until the date in the will. 6 weeks, he agreed. Then we had better not waste them arguing, Clara said, and for the first time since she had walked through that drawing-room door with mud on her boots, she felt something in her chest that was not quite hope, but was standing close enough to it to feel the warmth. Neither of them knew yet that the 6 weeks would not pass quietly. Neither of them could have guessed that the cousin named in the old Duke's will, a man called Lord Pemberton who had spent a year watching the calendar, with far more patience than grief, had already begun making arrangements of his own, certain that a hasty marriage born of debt and desperation would not survive the scrutiny he intended to bring against it, certain that the girl with mud on her boots was the weakest point in a fortress he meant to bring down stone by stone. The letter arrived on a Thursday, carried by a rider in fine livery, who did not wait for a reply, only delivered it into Mrs. Dobson's hands and rode away again, as though eager to be done with the errand. Clara was in the stables when word reached her that the Duke wanted her in the study, and something in the way Peter delivered the message, quick and careful, told her this was not an invitation to tea. She found him standing behind his desk with the letter spread open before him, his face gone the particular still white of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "What is it?" she asked. "My cousin," the Duke said, "Lord Pemberton. He has filed a challenge against the marriage." Clara crossed the room and read the letter over his shoulder, her eyes moving quickly over language that had clearly been written by a solicitor and sharpened by someone who knew exactly where to aim. The claim was simple, and she had to admit, cleverly built. A marriage entered into under financial duress, to settle a debt, arranged within days rather than through proper courtship, could be challenged as a marriage of convenience rather than genuine union, and if a court could be persuaded to see it that way, the old Duke's clause would treat the marriage as though it had never satisfied the will's requirements at all. The estate would pass into trust regardless, into Lord Pemberton's hands. "Can he do this?" Clara asked. "He can try," the Duke said. "Whether he succeeds depends on what a judge believes about the nature of this marriage, and my cousin has spent a year building a case that we married for nothing but convenience. He has witnesses from your father's house who will testify to the circumstances of our engagement. He has the timeline. He has, I am ashamed to admit, my own words in that drawing room, repeated back to me by more than one guest who found them worth gossiping about." Clara felt her stomach drop. One arrangement is much like another. "Precisely that," the Duke said grimly. "It will be read aloud in a courtroom as proof that I entered this marriage with no more feeling than a man buying a horse. And I gave him the words to use, freely, in front of a full room, before I had even learned your name." Then we will need to give the court a different truth to weigh against it, Clara said. The Duke looked at her, something sharpening in his expression, the look of a man recalculating an opponent he had underestimated. You are not frightened. I am furious, Clara said. There is a difference, and fury is far more useful than fear when there is work to be done. They spent the following days in a strange new closeness neither of them had expected, bent over documents together at the same desk, the Duke explaining the law as it applied to marriages and inheritances, Clara asking the sort of blunt, practical questions that cut straight to what mattered and skipped past what did not. It was, Clara thought more than once, the first time since her wedding that she had felt like a partner in this house, rather than a guest waiting to be told her place in it. Your cousin will bring witnesses to speak of convenience, she said, on the third evening, tracing a finger down a list of names the solicitor had sent over. We will need witnesses of our own, people who have seen us since the wedding, Mrs. Dobson, Peter, the staff who have watched us at dinner, at the stables, in this study. A housekeeper and a stable hand will not carry much weight against a peer of the realm, the Duke said. Then we will need something that carries more weight than testimony, Clara said, and something in her voice made him look up from the papers. We will need the court to see it for themselves. It was a risk, and they both knew it, the kind of risk that could hand Lord Pemberton exactly the ammunition he wanted if it went wrong. But by the end of that week they had agreed to it anyway, and word went out that the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe would host a gathering before the hearing, a dinner attended by half the county, including, pointedly, several men known to be friendly with the judge who would hear the case. Clara spent the days before the dinner more nervous than she had been on her wedding day, aware that every word she said, every glance she exchanged with her husband, would be watched and weighed by people looking for exactly the kind of coldness Lord Pemberton needed to prove his case. She had grown up plain-spoken and unpolished, and she did not know how to perform affection. She was not entirely sure yet that she felt. Not fully, not in the tidy way a court might want it named. You are worrying, the Duke said, finding her in the small parlor the evening before the dinner, staring at nothing in particular. I do not know how to pretend to be something in front of strangers, Clara admitted. I have never been good at pretending. It is rather the whole problem that brought us here. Then do not pretend, he said, sitting across from her, closer than he might have a month before. Pemberton is counting on finding a performance he can pick apart. Give him nothing to pick apart. Give him only what is true. And what is true? Clara asked. Between us, exactly? I would like to know, before I am asked to swear to it, in front of half the county. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, and Clara watched him search for words the way a man searches a dark room for a light switch he is not certain still works. I did not expect to want anyone's company again, he said finally. Not after Henry. I built this house to run without needing me to feel much of anything, and it worked, until you started fixing fences that were not broken and correcting my grooms and telling me the truth in a study where no one has told me the truth in years. I do not know the proper words for what that has become. I only know that when I imagine the next 20 years in this house, I no longer imagine them without you standing somewhere in the picture, and that was not true 6 weeks ago, and I find I am considerably more frightened of that than I am of my cousin's solicitors. Clara felt something in her chest crack open, quietly, the way ice cracks on a pond before anyone notices the sound. That, she said, is closer to the truth than anything either of us said at that altar. Will it be enough, he asked, to convince a room full of strangers looking for a reason not to believe it? I do not know, Clara said honestly, but it is enough to convince me, and I find that matters to me more than I expected it to. The dinner, when it came, was a careful performance of something that was not entirely performance at all. Clara watched Lord Pemberton arrive with 2 solicitors trailing him like hounds, watched him study the room with the sharp assessing eyes of a man looking for cracks, and found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid of him. She sat beside her husband through 4 courses of conversation, answered questions about the stables and the household accounts and the tenants with the same plain confidence she had always had, and watched the Duke, beside her, do something she had never quite seen him do before in company. Relax, just slightly, enough that the guarded stillness in his shoulders eased and something warmer showed through instead. It was not enough to satisfy Lord Pemberton, who left before dessert with a face like a closing door, but it was enough, Clara thought, watching him go, to make him nervous for the first time since his letter had arrived. A man building a case on coldness does not like walking into a room and finding warmth instead, however new and unpracticed that warmth might still be. He will bring the hearing forward, the Duke said, watching the carriage pull away down the long drive. He knows now that time is not his friend. Then we had better make sure it is ours, Clara said, and slipped her hand into his, without entirely deciding to, and felt him hold it back, without hesitation, for the first time since she had known him. The hearing was moved forward by 9 days, exactly as the Duke had predicted, and the county assembly hall, where it was held, filled with more spectators than Clara had expected for what was, on paper, a dry matter of inheritance law. She understood, walking in on her husband's arm, that it was not really the law people had come to watch. It was the story. A duke who had promised to marry any daughter offered to him, and the youngest one who had walked in late and somehow ended up standing beside him at the altar instead. She had become, without ever intending it, a piece of local legend, and now that legend was about to be tested in front of a judge and a room full of witnesses. Lord Pemberton sat at the opposite table with his 2 solicitors, dressed in the sort of understated elegance that was meant to look like restraint, and was, Clara suspected, calculated down to the last button. He did not look at her directly as she took her seat. He looked instead at the Duke, with the particular patience of a man who has waited a long time for something and does not intend to rush the pleasure of finally taking it. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, and the unhurried manner of someone who had presided over a great many disputes between families who claimed to love each other, opened the proceedings by reading the terms of the contested will aloud, and Clara listened to the cold legal language that had shaped the last 2 months of her life, laid bare for a room full of strangers. Failure to marry within 5 years of the death of the named heir. Passage of the estate into trust under the management of the next eligible relation. Hearing them read aloud, in that flat official voice, made them feel more dangerous than they ever had in the privacy of the study. Lord Pemberton's solicitor rose first, and his argument was every bit as sharp as Clara had feared. He walked the room through the timeline with careful precision. The debt, the drawing room, the offer made to any daughter regardless of which one accepted it, the wedding held within a fortnight, the marriage entered into, he argued, not from affection, but from arithmetic, a duke solving 2 problems with 1 convenient signature. He called 2 witnesses from her father's household, servants who had been present that first afternoon, and both of them, under careful questioning, repeated the words that had started everything. His Grace said, one of them recited, clearly uncomfortable but unable to avoid the plain truth of what he remembered, that it did not matter which daughter, that one arrangement was much like another. A murmur went through the room, and Clara felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. It was true. It had been said, in exactly those words, and no amount of warmth built in the weeks since could erase the fact that the marriage had begun exactly as coldly as Lord Pemberton claimed. The Duke's solicitor rose to make their case, and Clara listened to him describe the weeks that followed, the stables, the study, the dinner attended by half the county, and she could hear, even in her own ears, how thin it sounded laid out as legal argument, a list of small moments that meant everything to the 2 people who had lived them, and very little, stated plainly in a courtroom, to anyone looking for a reason to doubt. "I would like to call the Duchess," the solicitor said finally, to speak for herself. Clara rose, aware of every eye in the room following her to the chair set aside for witnesses, aware of Lord Pemberton watching her now for the first time since she had entered, with the sharp attention of a man waiting to see exactly where the crack in the wall would show itself. "Your Grace," the judge said, not unkindly, "the court would like to understand, in your own words, the nature of your marriage. Did you enter this union out of affection, or as a settlement of your father's debt?" Clara thought of every careful answer she might have prepared, every polished sentence a solicitor might have written for her to recite, and found, standing in front of that room, that she did not want to give any of them. She had built her entire life on saying the plain true thing even when it cost her, and she was not going to abandon that now, in the one moment when it mattered most. "Both," she said. A ripple went through the room, and she saw Lord Pemberton's solicitor lean forward slightly, sensing an opening. "I did not fall in love with the Duke of Ashcombe in that drawing-room," Clara went on, before anyone could interrupt her. "I did not fall in love with him at the altar either, if I am honest, and I have never seen much use in being anything else. I married him because my father owed a debt that would have ruined my family, and because a man I had never met before that afternoon said something careless and cruel about my sisters, and because I was angry enough, in that moment, to insist on being seen as a person rather than an interchangeable solution to a problem. That is the truth of how this marriage began, and I will not stand here and pretend otherwise simply because it is inconvenient to the argument my husband's solicitor would prefer me to make." She heard the Duke shift beside his table, but she did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the judge. "But a marriage is not only the day it begins," she said. "I have lived at Ashcombe for 2 months now. I have watched a man who built himself into a fortress after losing his brother, slowly, painfully, learn how to let another person stand inside the walls with him. I have fixed fences that no one else in that house thought needed fixing, and settled horses that 3 grooms before me could not manage, and sat across a dinner table from a man who said almost nothing to me for the first 2 weeks of our marriage, and who now tells me, more often than either of us quite expects, the true and difficult things he has spent years refusing to say to anyone. I do not know what the law calls that. I only know what it is to me, which is a marriage that started as a transaction and has become, somewhere in the last 2 months, something I would fight to keep, and I am fighting for it now, in this room, in front of all of you, because it is worth fighting for." The room had gone very quiet. Clara risked a glance at the Duke and found him watching her with an expression she had never seen him wear in public before, unguarded, entirely undefended, the look of a man who has just heard someone say the truest thing anyone has ever said about him and does not know what to do with his own face in response. Lord Pemberton's solicitor rose again, clearly intending to press the point about the drawing-room, about the careless words that had started everything, and Clara turned to face him before he could finish forming the question. "You will ask me about the words His Grace used that afternoon," she said, before he could. "I know the ones you mean. I heard them myself, standing in the doorway with mud on my boots, and I will tell you honestly that they made me furious enough to say something sharp back to a duke I had never met, which is not, I think, the behavior of a woman calculating her way into a fortunate marriage. Those words were cruel and careless, and my husband knows it better than any of you, because he has said as much to me himself, more than once, without anyone in this room requiring it of him. A man who has learned to regret his own cruelty is not the same man who spoke it. I would ask the court to consider which one of those men stands before you today." The solicitor, apparently unprepared for a witness who answered the accusation before it was fully asked, sat back down without further questions, and Clara returned to her seat beside her husband with her heart pounding loud enough that she was certain the whole room could hear it. The judge called a recess to consider the matter, and the hall emptied into the corridor outside in a wash of whispered conversation, Clara standing near a window with the Duke beside her, neither of them quite finding words for the silence that followed something so large having just been said aloud. "You did not have to say all of that," the Duke said finally. "I did," Clara said. "You have spent your whole life letting other people decide what your silence means. I was not going to let a courtroom do the same thing with mine." He looked at her for a long moment, and then, in front of the corridor full of whispering guests, in front of Lord Pemberton standing stiffly by the far wall, with his solicitors murmuring urgently at his elbow, the Duke of Ashcombe took his wife's hand and did not let it go. "I owe you an answer," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "You asked me once what I was offering you, and I did not have the words for it then. I have them now, if you will let me say them somewhere better than a corridor outside a courtroom." "Say them here," Clara said. "I have never much cared for waiting until things are convenient." He almost laughed, the sound rough with disuse, and then he did not laugh at all, his expression turning serious and open in a way she had only seen glimpses of before. "I love you," he said, plainly, the way she had taught him, without decoration or performance, the truest thing he had ever said in front of anyone. "Not because you fixed a fence, or settled a horse, or spoke more honestly to me in 5 minutes than most men have managed in 5 years. Because of all of it together, and because I no longer know how to imagine this house, or this life, without you standing somewhere in the middle of it. I did not choose you, that first day. I want to choose you now, in front of everyone who came here today expecting to watch a fortune argued over instead of a marriage." Clara felt something in her chest that she did not have a plain word for, something that had been building slowly since a stable-hand's mare had gone calm under her hand, since the candlelight under a study door, since a man had said sorry in a voice unpracticed at saying it. "I choose you too," she said, "for what it is worth, in a corridor, without a ring or an altar to make it official. I choose you." The judge's decision, when it came an hour later, ruled in their favor without much hesitation, finding the marriage genuine in its present character regardless of the circumstances of its beginning, and dismissing Lord Pemberton's challenge with a briskness that suggested the recess in the corridor had done rather more to settle the matter than anything argued formally inside the hall. Lord Pemberton left without a word to either of them, his solicitors trailing behind him like men already calculating their next unsuccessful venture, and the crowd that had gathered to watch a scandal dispersed instead, having witnessed something considerably less scandalous and, in its own quiet way, considerably more interesting. Clara and the Duke rode home together in the same carriage that had carried her to Ashcombe 2 months before, and this time she did not sit staring out the window at unfamiliar country, wondering what kind of marriage she had entered. She sat close beside her husband, his hand still holding hers, watching the same hedgerows and stone walls pass by, and felt, for the first time since a fence had given way and sent 3 sheep wandering into a neighbor's turnip field, entirely and completely certain of exactly where she belonged. That evening, back in the quiet halls of Ashcombe, with the portrait of a young, bright-faced man in the East Hall no longer a subject too painful to walk past without flinching, the Duke gathered the household staff, Mrs. Dobson and Peter and all the rest, into the great hall for what he announced, with something that was almost a real smile now, a permanent fixture rather than a rare and startled thing, was a proper celebration, long overdue, of a marriage that had finally become exactly what it should have been from the start. "To my wife," he said, raising a glass in front of the household that had watched their strange beginning unfold in silence, and had, in its own quiet way, been rooting for them the whole time, who arrived in this family late, and mud-stained, and entirely unannounced, and turned out to be the truest thing that has ever walked through that door. Clara raised her own glass, looking around the hall at the people who had become, without her quite noticing it happen, something close to a second family, and at the man beside her who had learned, slowly and with considerable difficulty, how to want something again after years of believing it was safer not to. "To fences," she said, "and the people who bother to fix them." The hall filled with laughter, warm and easy, the kind of sound that had never once echoed through those halls in all the weeks she had first arrived, and Clara thought, raising her glass to meet her husband's, that she had walked into that drawing-room late for the most important appointment of her life, and had somehow, against every careless word said that afternoon, arrived exactly on time.